So we're gonna do a review, and time permitting, we might do just a few verses introducing the book of Revelation. But what I wanna do is rather than just, I'm reminded of my new puppy, not mine, Alyssa's really, but the new puppy at the house. When he gets really excited, he'll start running, and then he'll just trip over himself because he's so excited trying to run so fast. And this is what I feel like I sometimes do on Wednesday nights. I'm so excited about the content that I try to go so fast I trip over myself, and I feel like a moron by the time we're all done. So we're going to try to slow down today and just do it piece by piece and make sure everybody's on the same page. And if we're doing well, then we'll continue on. Now I've given you these review sheets, which are basically, these are your cheats, right? This is for people who don't take notes, but you like to have notes later, even though you didn't take them, right? Here's the notes for you on everything we've done so far. And I've simplified it, and it's going to look like, why did it take us so long to do this, right? That was probably a good thing that we took our time. So let's start with the book of Daniel, and we'll just review some of our key things. You'll see how this sheet is set up. The first half of each page, and I say a page is a whole paper, front and back. The first half of each one is the facts that we can learn that are things that we know from this passage or this book or whatever. And then the second half is a summary, conclusions that we can gather, what we can glean. So let's start with Daniel. Notice that it says each vision in Daniel gives us information about the end times events, and together can give us a general timeline of eschatological things, which is a fancy way to say end time stuff. Okay. In Daniel chapter 2, we saw the image with the head of gold and the arms of silver, the chest and arms of silver, and then you have the middle region, the belly and the thighs of brass, and then you had iron for the legs, and the feet were iron and clay. And when the interpretation was given to Daniel, we learned these three key important things. The interpretation told us that after Babylon there would be three more world empires. And I even put here, if you want to check it out, verses 37 through 40 and Daniel, and we'll read some of this as we go through, because we're not in a hurry tonight. We're going to just work through everything we've done so far. So I'll go ahead and read that. Daniel chapter 2, verse 37 and through 40. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom of power and strength and glory, and wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. There's Babylon, the first kingdom. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. So we see that Babylon was going to be followed by three more kingdoms. There were going to be four of these world empires, starting with Babylon and going to the fourth empire. Then we found in verse 44 that it is during the time of this last of these four kingdoms that Jesus was going to return and set up his kingdom. I'm inserting Jesus in there. Okay, that's not actually in the text of Daniel. It's just the Messiah is coming. Okay, I'm inserting that Jesus is the Messiah. Verse 44. And in the days of these kings, he's referring to the time of the feet. It's connected to the legs of iron. The feet are made of iron and clay. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. There's the Messiah coming to set up his kingdom. That was going to be during that fourth empire. And when Jesus returns, the final empire will be divided. It will be weak and divided. We see that in verse 41. Whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it the strength of the iron. So it's going to be weak and divided. That means that's all we learned from Daniel chapter 2. Okay, let's move right along. Here's what we learned from Daniel 7 and 8. We learned that after Babylon there would come the Medo-Persian Empire, followed by the Greek Empire. This is in Daniel 8, verse 20 and 21. Verses 20 and 21 of Daniel 8. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Of course, that's speaking of Alexander the Great. And in this vision in chapter 8, the goat kills the ram, and that's exactly what happens. Alexander the Great destroys the Medo-Persian Empire. So this is all connected to the previous vision in chapter 7, where these same four kingdoms are listed. So we're given, okay, after Babylon comes Medo-Persia, comes Greece. This is all before these kingdoms actually came, right? That the names of them are even given. Pretty interesting. So then there was going to be a fourth kingdom, and that, of course, is the one we're really interested in, because that's when Jesus was going to come and return, according to chapter 2. Then we see a king in the divided Greek Empire, this is also in chapter 8, will commit an abomination in the temple of God that causes it to be desolate or unclean and unusable. And if you want to just slim it down to just the portion, the verses that speak about this in chapter 8, it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. This is speaking, we know from history, about Antiochus Epiphanes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, we're just going through the facts that we find in these chapters. Okay? So, there was going to be a guy connected to the Greek Empire who's going to commit an abomination in the temple and make it unclean or unusable. Then, the final empire, after those three, is going to be Rome. But we know that from history. In the passage, it just says that fourth empire in chapter 7 will one day be divided and controlled by 10 kings. Just like we heard in chapter 2, that it was going to be weak and divided. Now we know it's divided and controlled by 10 kings. Chapter 7, verse 24 says, and the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. That's also there in another fact. One king will conquer 3 of the 10 kings of the divided Roman Empire and take their place. This king will persecute the saints for 3.5 times. That's in chapter 7, verses 24 and 25. And he shall speak great words in verse 25 against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of a time. A time, 1 times 2, and then dividing of a time. So that's 3, 1 plus 2, plus the dividing of a half of a time. So 3.5 something, right? Okay, so we've gone through all this in context and showed how this is the conclusions to bring from these passages. And these are not making anything outside of the text. We're not trying to draw in anything else extra. We're just saying these are the bare bones facts that are found right there in the text. Okay, that's chapter 2, chapter 7 and 8. We're going to do some conclusions and summaries in a second. Chapter 9, we found that there were 70 weeks determined by God for fulfilling prophecy related to Israel, and we found that those 70 weeks were 490 years in context. These years begin with the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem, and we connected that to the rebuilding command to Nehemiah, and we defended that in when we talked about it. But that's in verse 25. For time, I won't read all of these verses here. But then after 69 of these weeks, according to Daniel chapter 9, which would be 483 years, those 490 years are 7 years for each week. That's it, right? So 69 of them would be 483, 7 years less than 490. After 69 of these weeks, the Messiah will arrive, and that happened in 33 AD, and he'll be killed, cut off or killed, and after that, a prince will come and destroy the temple, Jerusalem and the temple. That's all in verse 25 and 26 of Daniel chapter 9. Then, the final week, or the final 7 years of this prophecy, will take place sometime later, sometime after the temple is destroyed, because in this final 7 weeks, the temple has to be rebuilt. And this final, it's not 7 weeks, but these final 7 years, this final week. And in these final 7 years, we know that these 7 years will be characterized by a covenant between some leader and many people. A good assumption would be that many people includes Israel, because that week, that 7 years, is all about prophecy concerning Israel. So it's probably a peace treaty between Israel and a lot of other nations, right? So somebody makes a 7-year covenant, but halfway through the covenant, the same leader will commit an abomination in the temple of God that causes it to be desolate, unclean, and unusable. Very much like what we saw in chapter 8, where this Antiochus Epiphanes guy did an abomination in the temple. Then in chapter 11, really chapter 11, the one eschatological fact that you can draw from chapter 11 is that the abomination of the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes, spoken of in chapter 8, that's going to be a picture or a type of another abomination that a king commits in end times. Because when it starts talking about the abomination, it walks through the Greek Empire in chapter 11, king by king by king by king, until it gets to Antiochus Epiphanes, who commits this abomination. And then after saying that he does this abomination, it switches and it says, but the rest is for the time of the end. And then it starts talking about another king, not part of the Greek Empire, because none of it has ever happened. It's all new stuff that has never happened in history. And it's talking about the time of the end, the time of the end, the time of the end, and his abomination. And so you see, then this is now saying that, this one that's going to happen, this abomination that happens in the Roman Empire, is all pictured by this one that happens in the Greek Empire. And so that's what we learned from chapter 11. Chapter 12, at the time of this abomination in the end times, there will be trouble such as never was before. We find that in verse 1 of chapter 12. This I'll read because it's very simple to read without getting too deep into weeds. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to the same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book of life there, right? And then also we found out at the end of chapter 12, when Daniel's asking about timing, when is this going to happen? When is it going to happen? The only timing indication he gets is these 2 counts from the abomination until the end. He's told that from the time of the abomination until a blessed event happens, the thing that they're all waiting for, is 1,335 days. And something else that is important takes place for 1,290 days from the counting from the abomination, which leaves 45 days. So something happens for 1,290 days, and then after that thing gets done, there's 45 days left until the 1,335 days come, and that's what everybody's waiting for. So the idea is that when we put all these together, let me actually just read through, because I've already done this logically. So let me read through this logically as I've presented it to you. The visions of Daniel, when they're considered all together, they give us this following timeline. First, we learn of events that today are past; they've already been accomplished. The reign of the Babylonian Empire, that was 626 to 539 BC. That was all predicted that it was going to end, and then they were going to be taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire. Lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. The Medo-Persian Empire came on the scene around 539 and was conquered around 330 BC. Then, just as Daniel predicted, the Medo-Persian Empire was conquered around 330 BC by the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, and that went until about 146 BC. The kingdoms Daniel predicted were going to be split into 4 parts after Alexander the Great, and they indeed were. The first abomination was supposed to take place during the time of this Greek Empire, and it in fact did take place by Antiochus Epiphanes. All this stuff became true, but it's now past to us. It's not future for us. It's all done in the past. Then Daniel also predicted this 4th empire, and the 4th empire we know now, because we're looking backwards, was Rome. Rome did come, and it was during the time of Rome that the 483 years were finished, that the Messiah came, the Messiah was cut off, and the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. So all of that stuff has happened. Now, the rest of what we can learn from Daniel, we can piece together and put into a timeline of things that haven't happened yet, that have to be in the future. All right, future events that have not happened as of March 2022 AD. That's right now. Okay. Here's something that hasn't happened, but here's a basic timeline of the things that need to happen still. The divided reign of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire needs to reemerge and needs to be divided into a kingdom led by 10 kings. That has not happened yet. It's not happened at any time in history. And whether it'll be called the Roman Empire or not is not the point. The point is that it's somehow connected to the old Roman Empire, and it's led by 10 kings. Then one king is going to rise and conquer the other 3 in this empire. And he's going to make sometime after that, or maybe in the process of conquering the others, he's going to make a covenant apparently with Israel for 7 years. Halfway through those 7 years, he's going to commit an abomination in the temple, somewhat similar to what happened in Antiochus Epiphanes' days. And after that, there's a subsequent persecution of the saints for 3.5 years. Something happens for 1,290 days, which is probably talking about the persecution after the abomination. And then the coming of Christ comes exactly 1,335 days after the abomination of desolation. This is a really good, and I would argue really the only way to piece together what Daniel says. And all of this is just from Daniel, right? This is why Daniel gives us really good reason to be pre-millennial, to have the pre-millennial position. All right, so that's the Daniel stuff. Let's talk about Matthew 24 and what we found in Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, Jesus referenced the prophecy of Daniel and affirms Daniel's timeline of events and gives further insight. So here's what Jesus said when quoting Daniel in Matthew 24. And there's parallel passages, but Matthew 24 is probably the easiest one to go to. It's what people are most familiar with. Okay, verses 1 through 3 of Matthew 24, we get 3 things. The disciples ask Jesus about 3 things that they think will happen simultaneously. They say, when shall these things be? Because Jesus had told them about the destruction of the temple. They said, okay, when is that going to happen? And then they, assuming that these 3 things are all connected, they said, what is the sign of that coming and of the end of the world? Jesus, knowing that he wasn't coming when the temple was destroyed, that's going to be separated from his coming, he corrects them. Verses 4 through 14, Jesus answers, warning them not to think of the destruction of the temple as a sign of the end. He lists things that are not signs of his coming, but might grow worse and worse until he comes. And those things are false Christs, wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, famines, pestilences, earthquakes in diverse places, being afflicted and hated, believers betraying one another, false prophets, and the gospel going into all the world. He says all those things are going to happen, and then sometime after that, the end shall come. And then the end shall come. So what he's saying is all of these things are going to happen. He says they're the beginning of birth pains, which could be interpreted to mean that they're going to get worse and worse as we get closer. That's a fair interpretation. I'm not going to force that into that spot, but it could be interpreted that way. But he's not saying that they're signs of the end. He's saying they're just going to happen all the way up until the end. And they're going to be part of the end too, but don't think those are signs because earthquakes happen all the time. Then he answers their question. So because they were thinking that this war and destruction of the temple was going to be the end, he first said, no, don't forget. There's going to be lots of wars. There's going to be lots of those types of things. Don't get bogged down with that. But here is the sign of the end. And he quotes Daniel. In verses 15 through 35, Jesus answers the disciples' question directly, explaining what things are signs of his coming. They are the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel, the great tribulation, we find this in verse 15. But when he says the great tribulation, it's not what we think of the 7 years. It's the persecution of the saints, like has never been before. And those days of the persecution are shortened, he says, in that passage. He says that except those days should be shortened. No flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, they shall be shortened. So it appears as if it stopped before the end, which would work well with that 1,290-day period that we know stops 45 days before Jesus returns. After this persecution, the sun is darkened, the moon won't give light, the stars of heaven fall to the earth. Then Jesus will appear visibly, and his appearing will result in the death of his enemies, and angels will then gather up saints from all over the earth and bring them to Jesus. Okay, so he comes with angels, and they gather up saints. This is his coming that is seen, and there are signs leading up to it for 3.5 years. Jesus then proceeds in verses 36 through 51 to warn his disciples that the day and hour in which this will happen will be as follows. It will not be known, it will be sudden, and it will be surprising. It will be during a time when people are eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage. The beginning of this time period will be called the coming of the Son of Man, and that will include a sudden, surprising taking away of people from the earth. 2 in a field, one is taken, the other left. 2 at the mill, one is taken, the other left. Right? So those are the facts. Let's summarize that and kind of put that together. So Jesus then as we look at this and look at compared to Daniel, Jesus is actually confirming that final week timeline that we had put together based on best guesses from Daniel, right? Based on common sense. Now Jesus is actually confirming that. And he's predicting a rapture that will take some time before that last 3.5 years. And I'm going to argue it's before the 7 years. But here's how he confirms the timeline of Daniel. Jesus said that there would be an abomination, just like Daniel said. He said that after it would become a great persecution, just like Daniel said, like never was. Remember, Daniel said it was like never had been before since there was a nation. And then after this, there will be a space of time when the sun and moon are darkened and the stars fall out of heaven. That would make sense if there's a space of time between the end of the persecution and between Jesus coming back. 45 days of the sun darkened, the moon darkened, the stars falling out of heaven. Doesn't really make a whole lot of, it's not really very judgmental for the sun to be darkened for 1 day and Jesus comes back and that's it, right? That's not much of a judgment. For the sun to be darkened for 45 days, now that's a serious judgment. That's something to actually deal with. Anyway, so that all fits very well with what Daniel gave us. And then, after that, Jesus returns, which is, again, Daniel was giving us all this stuff, and it was all leading up to the Messiah returning and setting up his kingdom. So he did confirm the timeline of Daniel, but he also confirmed a rapture that takes place before this. And here's the points where we can find that. Because Jesus referenced Daniel that gives the exact number of days from the abomination unto his coming, and every major event that takes place between the two. He says, look, there's going to be abomination, there's going to be a persecution, there's going to be sun darkened, there's going to be me coming. It's all going to lead you straight to it. But then he says that the day and hour can't be known, which means he's not talking about the final 24 hours when he comes. He's talking about something else when he says day and hour. So that means day and hour does not refer to the final coming at the end of the 7 years. It must then refer to a time period, and that time period would have to begin before the abomination of desolation, because that's when he starts giving a countdown, a clock. That's when the signs start coming. So before that, this rapture stuff, where 2 are in a field and 1's taken, has to happen before that. All right? Since believers are not raptured immediately before the abomination, they can't be raptured in the middle of the tribulation, because then there'd be nobody to run to the mountains and to be persecuted, right? Right? So that doesn't work. So since the believers are not raptured immediately before or after the abomination, there are believers on the earth at the time who are persecuted for 1,290 days. We can conclude that this day and hour starts at the beginning of the 7-year period that leads up to the return of Christ. So the 7-year period is all a leading up to Christ's coming. And before that 7-year period starts, there's a rapture, there's a taking away. So this 7-year period will then begin suddenly, without warning, and no one knows when it will begin. There's a conclusion that we can also draw from Jesus' teaching. All right, we also know that the final 7 years begins during a time of supposed peace and safety, where they're eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage. And the entire time period Jesus refers to as the coming of the Son of Man. He said, when this starts, he says, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So the beginning of that 7 years kicks off the coming of the Son of Man. The whole 7 years can rightly be referred to, and is referred to, I will argue, in Matthew 24 as the coming of the Son of Man, all 7 years. We've been calling it the tribulation all this time, and God's like, no, it's really just my coming, the whole 7 years. This time period begins with people being suddenly taken from the earth while performing everyday tasks, not gathering to war, right? And we are to watch carefully for this 7-year coming of Christ to begin at any moment without any signs or to warn us further. So keep in mind, the 7-year tribulation, or that's what we call it, the 7-year coming of Christ, starts anytime. Anytime. Could be before we get home. Hopefully not while you're driving, because then some poor lost person is going to get hit by your car. But those types of things will probably happen. Anyway, so these are the things we know. I know we're late. I know we're running, but let me work through the summary of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and then we'll get out. Okay, because this is more recent, so we can just kind of skim through this a little bit. Okay, so Paul writes to the Thessalonians to remind them of eschatological truths that they already knew. Remember that, and to teach them a few additional concepts. We must glean what we can, knowing that there is more to the story, things that Paul did not think were necessary to write because the Thessalonians already knew them. And there's at least one thing I told you that kind of annoys me, that Paul didn't tell us because he knew that the Thessalonians already knew it. Okay, he writes on 3 end times events. In chapters 4 and 5, Paul tells us that there is this catching away. This is the rapture. And we call it rapture because rapture is where we get the word rapture from a Latin word, ramirium. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, that's how the Latin Vulgate translated this passage, catching away. But it just means to be caught up, to be caught away. And so we use the Latin word when we say rapture. But the English word would just be caught up. So he says that there's going to be this catching away. The Lord will descend with an archangel, the trump of God. The dead will rise first. Those who are alive and remain will be caught up to meet him in the clouds and will always be with the Lord. This day of the Lord, the rapture, comes when people say peace and safety. And God has not appointed us to wrath. Whatever that means, it's in there. I put it in there as another fact that we learn. Okay? 2 Thessalonians 1, Paul tells us these things about the Lord's being revealed in vengeance. This is about the return of Christ at the end, that Jesus will be revealed from heaven with his angels. Oh, that sounds like Matthew, where Jesus came with his angels to gather up people, right? He will take vengeance on his enemies, and he will be admired by all those that believe. And then in 2 Thessalonians 2, we hear Paul tells us about the abomination of desolation and the Antichrist. He says that we should not be troubled as if the day of Christ, or as Brother Frank fairly pointed out, it could also be translated day of the Lord, is already present because something needs to happen first before that day. So we should not be troubled like that's already happened because something else has to happen first. The thing that has to happen first is an apostasy and the man of sin being revealed. And the abomination of the end times includes this man of sin sitting in the temple claiming that he is God. This cannot happen right now because someone or something is letting, restraining, or keeping him from doing so. And the man of sin is the same wicked person who will be ruling on the earth when Jesus returns. That's in verse 8. And this man of sin will be accompanied by strong deceit and delusion among unbelievers. So these are the things we learned from 2 Thessalonians 2 in verses 1 all the way through 12. So let's summarize. Let's put those together, and then we'll call it a night. All right? So summary. The 3 events that Paul talks about, parallel events described in Matthew 24 and in Daniel, right? He talked about a catching away. He talked about the Lord being revealed from heaven and about an abomination of desolation. The catching away parallels what Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. Believers suddenly caught up. Matthew 24 tells us that people are in the field and are taken, right? He also said that Paul said that this would happen during a time when people said peace and safety. Remember, Jesus said it's going to happen like in the days of Noah, when they're eating, drinking, giving in marriage, all that kind of thing. Paul also said that this catching away is something that we must be watching for very carefully. This is exactly what Jesus said, right? So that parallels very well. When Paul talked about the revelation of Christ in II Thessalonians, that parallels what Matthew says. What Jesus said in Matthew 24, Jesus said when he returns after the abomination of desolation that he's going to be coming with his angels, because his angels are going to go and gather up the elect from the four corners, and that he will be coming to take vengeance, which is exactly what Paul writes. Jesus said, hey, you'll know where I am because you just follow the fowls. They're going to find all the dead carcasses of the people I'm going to kill. So that's all in Matthew 24. So now, the man of sin and apostasy that he talks about in 2 Thessalonians 2 parallels what Daniel says and what Matthew says. It parallels the little horn that will persecute the saints in Daniel. He will sit in the temple declaring himself to be God, Daniel 7, Daniel 11, Matthew 24. This is what Paul says. Paul says he's going to sit in the temple, declare himself to be God. He will be accompanied by strong deceit and delusion. Daniel 12:10 says this, Matthew 24:24. And he will be ruling when Jesus returns. Remember, Paul said this is the one who's going to be destroyed by the brightness of the coming of Christ. Daniel said this in chapter 2, that this is when Jesus comes to set up his kingdom. Daniel said this in chapter 7, that the Messiah comes and sets up his kingdom during this time. And Daniel said this in chapter 9, that the Messiah is going to come and set up his kingdom during the time of this guy who does this abomination. So we know now that our interpretation of Daniel is confirmed, because Matthew 24, Jesus confirmed it, and then Paul confirmed it. So we are not now out on a limb, right? All of these interpretations that we've come up with for these passages are all reinforced and solid Bible doctrine that every time you see any kind of timeline, any kind of timing given to us about the end times, this is a consistent timing. So now, when we jump into the book of Revelation, which I am so excited to get to, oh my goodness. When we get to the book of Revelation, we're going to see this timeline given to us so specifically and so clearly that it will be like, how do people deny this? How could it possibly be denied? So the timeline we've worked out so far is that there's this catching away, you could call it a rapture. Then there's a 7-year period of time in which there's a covenant made with Israel, this Antichrist guy who's leading this kingdom that now has 8 kings. He's the 8th one because he conquered 3 others. Then commits an abomination 3.5 years into it in the temple, declares himself to be God, starts persecuting all the saints who refuse to call him God. And then Jesus pours judgments on the earth, and Jesus returns. This is the timeline we have for future events without even looking at the book of Revelation. And now Revelation is going to dive into that timeline and give us so many details. It's going to be so sweet to see exactly all the details that are put in and all the information that we can glean from it. But the big thing to know, that all the other believers, all the way until John wrote Revelation, and the very last book that was finally given to the church, all the way up until that, everyone else still needed to know, listen, it could happen anytime. It could happen anytime. Even whether you know what's going to take place in that 7 years or not, know that 7 years could happen anytime. Know it could happen anytime. Just be ready. Just be ready. Just be ready. So let us be ready. Let us not be overly ready. All right? We don't need to go quit our job because it's going to happen tomorrow. But it could happen tomorrow. And let's be ready. And let's keep our eyes on Christ, because it's coming. It's coming. Any questions before we go? It would not be unreasonable to think that, but the rapture has to happen, when I say has to, it's possible that the rapture happens months before the 7 years start, because 7 years start with that covenant. It could happen right at the beginning of the 7 year, like instantly, right as that covenant's being signed, we're raptured, or it could happen months before. There could be things that happen after we leave that set up the kingdom. I don't know. I don't know. It could be that this covenant is part of setting up that kingdom. And that, the Antichrist is sort of a side guy who helps sign the covenant, and then he conquers in the next 3.5 years, because we're going to see wars, and we're going to see. So we're going to theorize a little bit about that when we start talking about the seals, because one of the seals is worldwide war, which could be the establishing of that empire, right? So it's very possible that we don't see a new Roman Empire emerge before we're raptured. We're not waiting for a Roman Empire to come and then we can be raptured, right? That can all be formed after we're raptured. As a matter of fact, I would argue it probably will be. Yeah. All right, let's pray, and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we thank you that you've given us such clear understanding of these things, being able to compare these prophecies. Daniel knew only what he was able to have himself, but we have not just Daniel, we have the words of Christ on the matter. We even have the Holy Spirit inspiring Paul as he wrote, and we have the book of Revelation. We have so much to understand about what's going to happen, and that's thrilling, that's fun, that's enjoyable. We thank you for it, but help us never to get so bogged down in all of it that we forget that you are coming. It can happen at any moment, and we must keep our eyes up. We must know that in every decision could be our last decision, and so it's an important decision. Every choice we make could be the last choice we make before we stand before you. And may we be ready. May we not be caught as in darkness. May it not overtake us as a thief, but may we be prepared and ready. And Lord, even so, come quickly. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.